Right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for day 2 of MTSS, Setting Up Academic Interventions and Supports. I'm really excited for today because our plan is to have y'all working a bit more with each other to talk about what those components we reviewed last time look like and will look like in your setting as you move forward with implementation and setting up your MTSS system at your school site, district, or whomever you are working with. So I'm very excited to begin with you. I want to just start off, as always, by just making sure to acknowledge our project, the Equity, Disproportionality, and Design Project. Our goal is to help prevent disproportionality in our schools. And one of the ways we know we can do that is by working with schools, districts, SELPAs, LEAs, in setting up MTSS systems to ensure that students are getting the supports they need when they need them. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and introduce and thank our team, our Executive Director, Russell Coronado, and Adrian Bautista, who is going to be helping us today. We also have Ryan and Marcus joined us today, and Olivia Rivera, who will also be helping me out today. So thank you to our team for being here. Our success criteria is continuing on from our last session, and today we're really going to be diving into those last two. So looking at those areas of strength and need for our further MTSS implementation and creating our plan for those next steps. So those are going to be our real focus for today. And I hope that with the way that things are laid out, that y'all will find that useful and you'll walk away with some action plans and action steps to get things going. As always, we like to just review community agreements. Again, just please be responsible, and our time together is short today. So we encourage and ask that you do participate in those breakout rooms when we get them going. Be respectful and assume the best of intentions from each other, and be safe. We want to create that safe space that opens and invites that dialogue and vulnerability. Today in breakout rooms, just to share real quickly, we will be actually spending a little bit more time, or all of our time actually. If you did come with a team, you will be spending that time in your breakout room with your teams planning. And those of you who are here as individuals, don't worry, we haven't forgotten you. And we've created a couple different options for y'all as well to get to work on thinking through planning for your implementation of MTSS at your site. As always, or as before, I should say, I want to draw your attention to the little green notebook in the bottom left-hand corner of the slides. That will be a reminder that that slide or some information on that slide will have some questions in your participant guide. So make sure if you haven't opened up your participant guide already that you go ahead and do that. And you can also, if you do not have a Google account, you can download it from the shared folder that Olivia has put in the chat as well. And then our little lightning bolts are those reminders that we will be jumping into breakout rooms. All right. Let's do a quick little icebreaker just to get us ready for our time together. And so it's spring, or it's about to be spring break. Some people might be finally looking at taking some vacations here soon, hopefully, with things getting a little bit better out there. So what comes to closest to describing your ideal vacation? In the chat, you can just either write staycation, city, or you can write the letter. We have a lot of beach bungalows, some cities, beach. Ooh, it's nice and spread out. Not very many people want to do any staycations. Maybe we've been home. Oh, there's one. Maybe we've been home a lot lately. We're ready to go take some adventures out there. Family backpacking. That sounds like fun. Lots of beach relaxation, it looks like, and some mountain retreats, getting out of the city. Nice. Well, hopefully for your spring break, whenever that happens this year, that you're able to take a little vacation, steal away to a little beach bungalow, mountain retreat, explore a new city, or if you want to just sit at home, read a good book, that's always something that I enjoy as well. All right. Let's do another quick creative warm up today. And for this creative warm up, I'm going to ask you to jump into that participant guide. And because today we're really going to be talking about working collaboratively within our MTSS team, how to set up that MTSS team and begin launching this work at your school site, I want to start us off by thinking about a time that you worked with a highly effective team. And so in your participant guide for the next just minute, I want you to describe why or what made it so effective. What were some of those characteristics or aspects of that team, that highly, highly functioning and effective team, that were so effective? Once you've done that, if you'd like to share one thing in the chat that you felt really made your team effective, we'd love to see some of those ideas. Committed to a shared vision, absolutely. Common goals, communication, hope, honest conversation, reliable, respect, efficient, proactive, no excuses, diversity, trust, everyone was accountable, open communication, a lot about communication. I like this too, willingness to step in and step back. Playful. We always do want our work to be fun, right? Positive. Absolutely. Focused on that same goal. So I see a lot of those similar trends across. And so as we do talk and work some in your team today, hopefully when you come together, you can really think about those characteristics and how you can build them as you build up this MTSS team together. Maybe you already have an MTSS team or a site leadership team of sorts, and you're going to be using some of that in your work here with us. We're going to dive into really what it does look like to have an MTSS team on your school site. So, and you'll spend some time talking about this, talking about what procedures you want to have in place, and really keep in mind these characteristics of that highly effective team that y'all have just shared, so that hopefully you can take some of those aspects into your work together. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Next, I want to share a little story with y'all as we start our time again today. And it's a story about me. I was sharing this story with Olivia earlier, and I found this photo, and it's from, back in the days when I was probably in elementary school, and we have the chalkboard there. And the little blonde girl in that left-hand corner looks a lot like I did probably in elementary school. I had a braid often, keep my hair back. I like had a double take, like, oh, is that for me from when I was a child? It is not. But I want to tell a story just briefly about when I was actually in first grade. And when I was in first grade, I had a teacher named Miss Smith, and she was young, she was new. I remember her having a pet turtle. Everybody wanted to take that turtle home over the breaks. Well, in Miss Smith's class, we had these small groups that we would work in. And I'm sure y'all remember that when you were a student, and maybe even now in your schools. And they were the ones where you would often have the group names like the Redbirds or the Blackbirds, the Bluebirds. And I don't really remember the color of the bird of the group I was in, but what I do remember is knowing that when it came to those groups for reading, I was in the group with the kids who couldn't read. And so I actually was one of those students in first grade that really, really struggled with decoding. I had decent comprehension, but that skill of reading was truly a struggle. I would complain. I remember complaining to my parents often that my eyes would burn, that words would move around on the page. And poor Mrs. Smith, or wonderful Mrs. Smith, I should say, she was doing everything to help me. I would go before school to work with her. I remember my parents taking me to get my eyes checked. And I did get glasses, but that really didn't help resolve a whole lot. I continued to struggle with the coding the rest of elementary school, into middle school and high school. And that's kind of another story for another time. But in first grade in particular, I really remember feeling so defeated when it came to trying to read. I didn't like it. but I loved just the stories of it. And so even though I struggled with reading, I always remember that Miss Smith made me feel that love and connection. And while I was really hard on myself, she made me feel like I belong and allowed me to step up and be a leader in class in different ways. And so I think that even though that struggle was really there, and I remember that struggle, and that struggle continued with me for the rest of my educational career, when I talk about my favorite teacher that I ever had in school, it was Miss Smith in that first grade. So I think there's just something so powerful about being a child, and now as an adult, thinking back to those struggles in elementary school and having that experience still be that teacher. I think it says a lot about her as a teacher, that she is still that teacher that I find my favorite, because it very easily could have been a different experience for me and can be a different experience for our students now who are struggling. So I want us to think about ourselves in school right now. And as you think about yourself and what life or what your experience was as a student, reflect for a minute about what was an area, a topic, or a subject, or something that you remember struggling in. And what type of experience did you have? I want you to think and write in your participant guide and describe that experience. Was it that positive experience like I had, where I can still talk about Miss Smith and that time that I struggled, but she was my favorite teacher and that was my favorite experience of elementary school? And then I also want you to think about, how could this experience influence the way that we consider helping struggling students within our own system? So for the next 2 minutes, just write in your participant guide about your experience as a student. Hopefully now our brain is on, it's done a little creativity, it's reflected a little bit about our own experience, because now we're going to jump quickly into a quick review and then start talking about what our planning can look like in terms of implementing and moving forward with MTSS. If you are just joining us, please make sure to check out the chat for the participant guide and our participant folder. And welcome today. You will see in the participant folder, there is a specific folder for day 2. Make sure to check that one out. That has the resources you will need for our time together today in particular. All right, let's do a really brief review. We saw this last time. This is that proactive and preventative framework that integrates data and instruction to maximize student achievement and support students' social, emotional, and behavioral needs from that strengths-based perspective. Using MTSS, we have that framework for educators to engage in that data-based decision-making, which is at the center, related to program improvement, high-quality instruction, and intervention. And also always considering those social emotional learning and positive behavioral supports to ensure that our students achieve positive outcomes in their schools. And ultimately, we want to consider each of these 4 components as we start to plan our MTSS system in our school site, starting with that screening. What type of screening are we using throughout our system? What types of universal screening are we using? And how are we also monitoring and doing screening at each of the tiers to make decisions through our progress monitoring processes, which we'll talk a lot about today, ultimately, so that our multi-level prevention system is set up so that students are able to move in, out, and throughout based on that need that they have. We talked a little bit last year that we wanted, or last week, I apologize, about that tiered instructional framework where tier 1 was those universal supports, tier 2 were additional supports, and tier 3 were those intensive supports for students. And in terms of academic supports, moving through those tiers, students can move throughout those tiers based on the specific content area, maybe something as specific as just phonics or decoding like myself, and not require those additional interventions or tiered supports in all of those different content areas, or even in all of the different focuses in that one content area like reading. So please keep these in mind as we start to plan out. They will be worked through in your planning time today, and hopefully they will become more clear as we step through and work through some of that today. All right, I do see one chat. Olivia, if you could. It looks like one person needs the folder again, if you wouldn't mind sharing that folder one more time. So let's take a moment to reflect on our time last week. So what was something that you remember and are interested in learning more about during our time together today or in the future? Just quickly think about that. You can write it down in your participant guide. And hopefully we cover that during our time today. Let's jump right in. We have a lot to cover, and I want to give y'all as much time as possible to work together to talk through these components. So let's jump right into implementation and what implementation of MTSS can look like for your site, district, SELPA, whatever it is, the group that you are here working with today. We want to first talk about implementation and as an understanding of the essential components of MTSS. Research suggests that effective implementation is a challenge for educators. We know that we have so many different things piled onto our plate at different times, and it can be easy to jump from one initiative to another. We know that, however, effective and successful implementation does require that ongoing planning, continuous improvement, and sustaining and extending and expanding our efforts. And so MTSS truly is the type of support system that requires us to continually plan and follow some implementation guidelines to ensure that once we implement some of these practices and programs, that it doesn't just stop. It isn't something that fades into the background, but it's something that we continue to reflect on, build on, and grow as our students change and grow, as our staff grows and changes, so that we can continue to work with whatever students need in our school site. Let's break down that implementation cycle that is called out by MTSS for Success a little bit more. This first phase is that assess, plan, and prepare phase. And during this planning phase, we want teams to focus on building that infrastructure necessary to support the MTSS implementation. So activities might include conducting a needs assessment, identifying your priorities. Some of you brought this up in terms of working with a strong team, establishing a vision. So really talking about what is your vision and your goals for your MTSS at your school site, inventorying your resources, and ultimately talking about how you're going to develop your implementation and evaluation plans. During this first phase as well, you'll want to spend some time talking about what types of assessments you're going to use, your evidence-based intervention. So it's really laying that framework and that foundation for how we're going to move in to that next phase, which is really that time to start sort of implementing. So, and it's that initial implementation phase. When we start this process, we're taking those assessments, those interventions that we identified during phase one, and starting to see how they're going to work within our system. Is it going to probably be perfect the first time? No, if it is, that's fabulous and great, keep going. But it's important to understand as we are starting this implementation in this first phase of implementation of MTSS that we're continuing to monitor that fidelity, checking to make sure that those interventions that we're using are effective, that the screeners that we're using are giving us the information we need to make effective decisions, and that we're going back and looking at how we can continue to improve and problem solve through our regular teaming, so that we can continue just to make the implementation stronger and stronger, increasing that quality of instruction and ensuring that all of those 4 essential components are implemented with fidelity. So it's important to remember that full implementation of these essential components, those 4 components in the diagram I showed previously, is necessary to realize those full benefits of implementation for MTSS. So when you're talking about implementation, it is key to use that strong screening to ensure that you're doing progress monitoring regularly, to talk through what that multi-tiered support system looks like at your school site, and ultimately to bring all those together to make those data-based decisions on a regular basis. And then finally, we talk about that sustaining and scaling up, which is that third phase, and that's just continuing to grow our implementation. As you dive in today and we talk a little bit further about implementation, and I'm going to share some about my experience. There are obviously ways that your team might feel more comfortable in terms of implementation, but I do think there is something to be said about going deep and focusing on one area first, to ensure that we're implementing that well, and then starting to sustain that and scale up and looking at those different components that we can continue to add on, just so that we ensure that it doesn't feel like that another initiative that we're just trying to implement really fast and failing to do in a way that is strong and as beneficial as it could be for our students. All right, we talked a little bit about this implementation cycle and those components according to MTSSforsuccess.org. Today, I'm going to go through 3 different sort of components in our work and how we can implement MTSS based on those phases that MTSS for Success shares, and also based on some resources from other MTSS research organizations, and how we can truly start to look at what we need to implement MTSS with success at our school site. So the first area we're really going to dive into is that needs and resources assessment. So y'all are going to look back at the rubric that I briefly brought up at the end of our time together last time. And you're also going to spend some time talking about what resources currently exist in your system. And so that's that part of that initial phase that you might be thinking about in terms of implementation. Once we've done a bit of that, we're going to talk more about the MTSS infrastructure and support mechanisms. So what does an MTSS team really look like? What are those components of a successful MTSS team? And what different support mechanisms are necessary for it to be as effective as possible? And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about, and I'll share a few different implementation plans and how you can start to plan some action steps for making this live in your system. All right, first things first. Needs and resources assessment. Last week, I shared with you and asked for you to take some time if you had it, I definitely recognize it's only been a week and y'all are very, very busy, but to take a look at our rubric that is created through MTSS for Success and AIR on what some effective areas that are broken down in terms of MTSS could look like, and to do some self-rating. The rubric was in your participation guide and it looked a little bit like this. And I asked you to pick a particular area that stood out to you. So one area might have been progress monitoring, for example, and to take some time to either highlight what would be a 5 or a highly effective part of this rubric. So under progress monitoring tools, that indicator, this is what highly effective use of progress monitoring tools would look like, to highlight those areas of strength, or green, and then to highlight areas of growth, yellow, so that you could just reflect on some of these areas that are called out in terms of MTSS implementation and where y'all are as a system. I understand, again, you may not have had time for that today, so we are going to give you a little bit of time to reflect on that. If you did, that's great. You're going to be ready to jump into some discussions as a system about those next steps that you could have. The reason that we really talk about using rubrics like this, and this one in particular is very, very detailed. There is another rubric that I put in your folder as well that you're welcome to use, called the Swift Fidelity Integrity Assessment. I really liked this rubric in particular because it was very detailed and broke down those 4 components of progress monitoring, screening, multi-tiered support systems, and database decision making. And so it really broke down different aspects of those components with a lot more detail, and allowed us to really break down what effective use and implementation could look like in our schools. We use these rubrics to be a reflection tool for us about where we are in terms of implementation, and also to be a planning tool. So what we can do and how we can take next steps to ensure effective implementation. Whenever we talk about using rubrics within the MTSS system, it is something, especially if you look at some of the rubrics that like PBIS uses, which is the TFI, they recommend at least twice a year, 3 times a year if you can, to consistently review the rubric and what those, what systems, what supports are in place at your school site, and to use it as a tool to plan your next steps to ensure that effective implementation. Using rubrics like this really helps us with that fidelity of implementation, right? It's that gold standard, that standard that we know can drive our work forward. And while we might not always be meeting everything in all of the areas, it definitely can give us clear ideas of what the effective implementation can look like. So in a few minutes, I'll give you some time to talk through this rubric as a tool to use as you are thinking about how you're going to implement as that fidelity check for your system. The next piece in this needs and resources assessment section that we're going to spend a little bit time on today is a resource inventory. And I actually pulled this resource inventory from Swift. If you're not familiar with Swift, you will get familiar with some of their tools today. It is something that the California Department of Education does use when they talk about their MTSS implementation as well. And they have some great, great resources for schools, for districts, for LEAs. And this is a resource that I find was really helpful. It breaks down resources that are beneficial in MTSS implementation, gives that definition or that intention of use, and allows you to reflect as a system as to what you have so that you can plan and consider what you might need to support the implementation at your school site. So for example, this resource inventory breaks down personnel. So what personnel do you have on your school site that might be able to support providing interventions for students? If you don't have any personnel, obviously some schools don't have that luxury. What How could you maybe use your personnel that you do have in your school site in different ways? Could you plan all of your first grade teachers to do a specific phonics reading lesson at the same time so that then they can break up, split up, and provide different intervention level groups between each other on their campus? So it's really about giving you some opportunity to think through and get creative about the resources that you have on your campus. Facilities, if you have extra facilities in your campus, what types of curriculum you do have, if you have specific intervention curriculum, if you don't have specific intervention curriculum, what curriculum you might want to look into, what resources you want everyone to use, so getting explicit on that. And so you can just see here that these are just some different aspects of that foundational planning that we can do in terms of implementing MTSS that's going to help us start to move forward and use this information to make better decisions as we start that planning phase. So this is going to take us into our first breakout room. And I want to, before I go into that first breakout room, I'm going to share with you, you are going to review the rubric section you selected. If you didn't choose that section, that's okay. I'm going to ask you to go back through and look at the rubrics and talk through one. If you did choose a section, why did you choose that section? What stood out to you about it? Was it an area that you felt like your team could move into next? Is it an area in particular you feel like you struggle with the most? And then once you discuss that area, what strengths you have, what areas and next steps you could take, I want you to take some time to look at those other areas. And then the next thing I want you to do is to review that resource inventory. And so what resources do you currently have available, and what do you need to investigate a little bit further in terms of those resource inventory? Before I send you in there, I'll put this up in just a minute. I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to share with you and walk you through what is in that folder so that you can see exactly what you do have access to, because I did organize the folder a little bit differently. And I feel like, I hope it is helpful to y'all today as you get into these breakout rooms. So if I share this screen, this is what the day 2 folder looks like. In our external folder, you'll just click on day 2. And then what you'll be able to do is click just right here. This is that first section, needs and resources assessment. And here is the rubric. So this is the SWIFT rubric that I mentioned for a minute. This is the MTSS rubric, which I pulled the information in your participant guide from. And this is a larger rubric, which breaks down by those 4 areas, screening tools, and you can see a 1, a 3, and a 5. I just shared with you previously that 5, so it wasn't too overwhelming, but this is a rubric in there that you can start to look at and review. And there is a summary sheet if you do choose to use it, where you can actually give yourself scores for each area and then use this to plan your next steps if you would like to. And also in your participant guide, just to draw your attention here, if this is easier for your team as you jump into the breakout room, at the very bottom again is those rubrics that were in our last participation guide. So if this is easier for you to really dive into and look at, this is here for you as well. All right, we're going to jump into our first breakout room, and I will put up again this breakout room. If you want to take a quick screenshot of it, you're welcome to. This is what you will be discussing. You'll be just going over those rubrics, a specific section you selected, and or any other areas that you're interested in looking at, and then also review and begin to talk about the resources inventory, which is in that day 2 folder as well, or it should be. I'll make sure that it is. It's also linked in your participation guide. And I want to share briefly, though, as we're going to go into breakout rooms, we did our very best. Adrienne, our amazing clerk, did her very best to take all of the schools, districts, SELPAs, counties, that we saw in registration and create breakout rooms for them. That does not mean that we got everyone. So we do want to just acknowledge that first. We may not have you. We did our very, very best to break you down by schools. Perhaps you'd rather be in just a single district. So we're going to open the breakout rooms in a minute. If you do see your school or your district and you're here with your team, please jump into that breakout room and get going on your work. If you don't, hang back and we'll work with you to either figure out creating a new breakout room for your school and your team, or breaking down some of those breakout rooms and just having y'all go into one instead of all separate ones if that's what you need. Also, if you're here as an individual, when we open the breakout rooms, there are two different options. The first option is going to be individual collaboration. If you're here as an individual and you'd like to bounce ideas and work with others, then you'll be able to jump into that breakout room. And so it will be for individuals to be able to just collaborate, share what they are doing with each other, bounce ideas off of each other. Or if you're an individual and you want to just be able to do some work on your own, there will be an independent individual breakout room as well, and you can go into that breakout room. So we'll have about 20 minutes because we do think it'll take us a little bit of time to figure out and get these breakout rooms set up for this first round, so that going forward, you'll be able to just jump in and out of these and work together collaboratively a lot easier. With that, Adrian, I am going to have you open. Thank you. I cannot take credit, but my teammate has an incredible playlist.
Well, it's organic. It's going to continue to grow. We got some other genres to add on there as well.
Welcome back, everyone.
Nice. Good job, Marcus. Love it.
All right. I'll pause that. It'll be back. Don't you worry. Welcome back. As we're jumping back in, I would love to just hear if there's anyone that would be willing to just share what your team, some of the conversation your team engaged in. Is there maybe one team that would like to share anything that they discussed during this time about either the rubric or the resources inventory? You can just unmute yourself.
I was proud to see that our group had a vision of what this could look like, and that they were farther along than my school is at. So I was grateful to have the resource to call them and say, hey, like, show me your vision so that I can try to match it so that we're all unified in the same way.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else? I do understand. I think something that I just want to call out is I'm sure that there are teams here that have, like you just shared, some of these components working great already. And there might be other components that they're still building out. And we just hope, though, that this time together will really allow you to come together with that same, like you said, a same vision, really align the work that you're doing, maybe set it up more clearly and start to really put those systems and those structures in place, especially those areas that you're still growing and developing. Our next section we're going to dive into is kind of a heavy one. And so it'll be broken down into two different parts. The first, or each of the components that we're going to talk about in terms of MTSS infrastructure and support mechanisms, we're going to talk about that team composition. Some of y'all might already really have your team composition, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. We'll talk about our operating procedures and break those down a little bit and give you some time to make sure you have those all in line. We'll briefly talk about school-wide schedules and the way we could maybe utilize those to support our work within the MTSS system. We'll do another sort of conversation and I'll share a resource on how you can develop your tiered instruction matrix. And we'll talk a little bit about data. So this is kind of a longer section. So we're going to break it up into two different times for you to go out and collaborate with your team. It might not be as long of an amount of time, but at least it'll give you some discussion time to talk about those action steps and your next steps. The first thing that we're going to talk about is team composition. And so when we look at the research around MTSS and whether you're looking at your MTSS team for behavior or academics as we are today, it is important that we have individuals, as this quote says, that are expertise in different academic areas and that are they're also all just really wanting to talk about how we're going to set up that system change. And so when we do talk about MTSS, teams should be something that immediately comes to mind. So when we look at some of the effective and the research-based tools that are out there, especially around PBIS, where they have fidelity instruments and rubrics, this team component is really critical to ensure that we're working together to make decisions about students in an equitable way. And so when we talk about setting up our MTSS team for academics, it's important that we follow some of those same guidelines. We want to make sure that we have members from our team with different backgrounds, that we have different perspectives, expertise, experience, and that ultimately we're always focused first on what's best for the students that we're serving. So I do also really encourage a parent or a community member, because they do have that unique perspective as well as to what it feels like to be on the receiving end of maybe some of this information, and also to be able to give some perspective on how it can be better communicated throughout your community in terms of what types of supports are being provided to our students. I know as a site leader or as a school site, it's really easy. We all have those parents that are also staff members. It's really easy to pull one of those parents on. I really encourage you to, while you might have a parent in that regard, a part of your team, to think about a parent who isn't as familiar with the school system, because they can give you a really unique perspective on the communication and involvement of the community aspect of working within MTSS, which is something that is an important feature when it comes to MTSS. And so additionally, another component I have on here is this idea of students. So upper elementary school students can really give some unique perspectives about how it feels to be somebody who's maybe moving in and out of different supports. And then in middle and high school, our middle and high school students really do have such great, unique experiences and voice. And the more and more we talk about MTSS, in those grade levels, the more and more that the idea of ensuring that we have opportunity for student voice comes up. So I highly encourage you, if you are in middle and high school, to consider having a student a member of your team. So when we go into our next breakout room, if you don't already have your team ironed out, I'm going to encourage you to walk through this and talk about these different roles. Doesn't mean there is just one for each one. Absolutely not. You can have multiple general ed teachers, a few different special ed teachers, but also remember, when you're talking about your team composition, the larger it gets, the more people, the more difficult it might be to engage in a discussion. So really find that happy sweet spot in terms of your team, because they are going to be those that are making those decisions with you about instructional implementation, about your decision rules for students moving in and out of the tiered system. And we'll dive into that a little bit more. So team composition is, who are those members of our team? And then team operating procedures. When we talk about our MTSS teams, it's important, and research tells us that having regular monthly meetings can help ensure that we are regularly talking about our student data. We are regularly making those decisions that are going to move our students in and out and throughout those tiers. And it also just makes sure that our meetings don't become so lengthy and long that people forget what we're talking about. So those quick, regular monthly meetings are critical. Our participant roles are clearly defined. So think about any meeting that you might have, whether it's a grade level meeting, maybe a staff meeting, you have roles, right? So have somebody who's going to be that facilitator, a note taker, somebody else who might be the person who does always bring us back to talking and focusing on students. So defining some participant roles within those operating procedures. You have a consistent meeting format. And so that really comes down to, we all know that when we're in those meetings and they're different every time, it feels jumbled, right? But when we have that consistent meeting format, we can jump in, we get our roles, we get going right away, everybody's valuable time is honored, and we get to business. Minutes are taken at each meeting. So these minutes really serve as part not only of the way that we're tracking the decisions that we're making, but we're also talking about those action steps that we're going to be doing and monitoring the decisions that we're making to ensure that they are equitable, that we are thinking about students. We're able to, and I'll share a few minute taking guides in a minute, but we're able to really go back and see what we've already discussed and plan for those next steps. It doesn't keep us talking in circles, as sometimes it can feel like we do within different team meetings. And then finally, part of those team operating procedures are going to be that an action plan is utilized to make decisions and to track progress. That can be part of those team meeting minutes, right? Where you just say, okay, at the end of this meeting, this is our next step. This person is responsible, and that becomes an agenda item for your next team meeting. So I'll share an example of what that can look like in terms of taking minutes, but it is just making it very clear that at each meeting we're accomplishing something, we're making a plan for our next step, and then we're following up to ensure that we've implemented that, what we've said that we want to implement. I do want to address one comment in the chat real quick. Is this where a counselor would also be included? Absolutely. A counselor is somebody that can definitely be included. Maybe you do have an intervention teacher. They would be obviously essential to be a part of that conversation. Anybody that you feel like would really be critical in being a part of this team should be a part of this team. Another thing I did want to talk about when we're talking about our MTSS teams and those team operating procedures is that when we are looking at school sites, it can be, depending on the size of your school site, it might seem intimidating to have multiple teams functioning, right? When you look at how you can set up an MTSS team, you can set it up with a few different teams. Maybe you have one team that looks at it overall, one team that just meets and talks about tier 2 interventions, one team that just meets and talks about tier 3 interventions. And then you might still have your student study team that talks about those, really tracking those supports for students if you have a student study team. And then maybe have this other team over here. So it can feel overwhelming to have so many teams on a school site. You really need to decide what works for the capacity of staff that you have at your school. I've worked with schools that have one MTSS team, and they talk about all 3 tiers during their meetings. And they also talk about all 3 components: the academics, the behavior, and the social emotional components and supports for students. It's also easy, if you have the staff and the capacity and you feel like it's best for your school to have those different, then you can absolutely have those separate as well. And so I think that it's important to acknowledge that there can be some flexibility when you're talking about this team. It doesn't always have to be the same people meeting on everything if you have the capacity to break that up. And so really, though, the idea around MTSS is, when you think of that triangle and you think of the fact that MTSS supports academic interventions, supports behavior interventions, supports social emotional interventions, that we utilize the features in those tiers in a systematic way. So we have those clear core universal first instruction. We have procedures in place for how students move into additional support in tier 2, and we have similar procedures in place that allow us to move students into that more intensified supports. So whether you have a team for each of those or one team for all aspects of MTSS, making sure that those components, those operating procedures are consistent, is only going to help alleviate questions and stress around what this implementation is going to look like at your school. This is a quick little section because I think that some powerful conversations can be had around the team and the team operating procedures if you don't already have these pieces in place. And so I'd like you to head into a breakout room, and you're going to take some time to talk about what your team, if you don't have a team, who you might need to invite to be a part of your team. If you do have a team, if you feel like it's well-rounded, or if you need any additional team members. And then to really talk about your operating procedures, clarify or create any of those needed components. If you don't already have a note-taking system, in a minute, I'm going to show you 2 samples. These are definitely not the perfect or complete, but they are 2 places that maybe would spark some ideas for you if you have something that you just want to add something to already. And then I want you to focus on that note-taking system, because as we engage in some of those action planning for the rest of the day, I hope that you could practice using that to have your agenda on one side, your notes on the other, and talk about what action steps at the end of the day that you're going to take. So in a minute, you'll go into a breakout room. Before you go into that breakout room, though, I do want to, again, share with you 2 of these samples. I lost my screen there for a minute. Gotta love when you have so many screens open, right? Okay, stop sharing. And then I'm going to share with you the Google Drive again, so that you can see 2 of the samples that are in there. One is going to be a little bit more complex. So this time we're going to go into the infrastructure and support mechanisms. And there's all sorts of different documents in here. The first one that you're going to be able to look at is a sample meeting minutes template. And this is just modeled briefly off of some other templates that are out there in regards to how you can take notes. And so it looks something like this, where you can add your team member, your role, and then you would just mark if they're present for each meeting. You have your date and your information here, and then you already have your next meeting date planned, right? So you know when that next meeting is going to be. You'd have your agenda item. If it's completed, you'd put an X here, you'd write notes for next, and then you can create your action steps down here, which would include it looks like this got a little moved around, a little funky, but it would include the person responsible and that action step. So you can take something like this. There's also this tips meeting guide, which is a little bit more complex, but the same idea, right? It has today's meeting date, the next meeting date, the people who are present, the agenda items for this meeting, and those things that you've maybe have come up for this meeting that you know are important to ensure are on your agenda for the next meeting. The overall status. So this is your systems overview. So your tier 1, maybe it's in reading that you're talking about, how you're talking about data, the current level rate, and then there's these problem solving processes. So you can describe the problem, you can walk through it. So what is a statement of the problem? What's your goal and timeline? What actions can you do? What fidelity can you collect? So this is just another way you can break down kind of that problem solving aspect of working together as an MTSS team and making decisions together. And so, and then you can see as well, here's another problem solving. So some more housekeeping. So this is just another sample of a meeting minutes template that you could use. So right now, again, you're going to jump into a breakout room for just about 10 minutes or so. I don't want to spend too much time because I think a lot of you might have some ideas about your teams and your team operating procedures. And you'll have a little bit more time once we get through the rest of this section to really just look at your team operating procedures, look at your team makeup, and make sure you have those ironed out as we get into the rest of our planning today. So again, you can see the folder for just the infrastructure and support mechanisms is there. We'll open up the breakout rooms and send you in for about 10 minutes to work with your teams and to talk about these areas. Your note-taking guide, your participation guide also has areas for you to take these notes in as well if you would like. So please use the resources and make sure you have your team outlined and some of those operating procedures discussed. If you want to go ahead and open breakout rooms. break. We'll start back up again in about 10 minutes and finish our afternoon, just to make sure y'all get a little personal break if you need one. So at 10, let's actually try to start at 10:10. We'll start back up. So about 8 minutes. If you need a couple minutes, then extra, go ahead, but we will be going in another breakout room again as well. So again, 10:10, we'll be back. Have a nice quick little break and we'll get right back to it.
Marcus.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
Well, we
Oh,
are
you guys are
enjoying
making
it.
me laugh. Look, I've got tears. You guys are making me laugh so much. That's funny.
Oh, well, welcome back, everyone. I feel like I should ask a different question than the one I have right now to ask y'all, but I know what Michael's might be, I guess. So here's just a quick little survey to see how everyone's feeling. And who would you most want to have dinner with here? And if there's somebody in particular, I love it. Brandon already knows an athlete that you would. Okay, all of the above. If there's someone in particular that you're up to sharing, go ahead and share their name as well. We have some entertainers, historical figures, academics. Whitney Houston. Oof. Oh, a political figure. Okay. Jackie Robinson. Joan Rivers. Helen. Oh, there. Oh, you have one for each. Ozzy Osbourne is your entertainer, huh? Okay, Helen Keller. Thank you, Sarah. A lot of athletes. I just find this interesting. And these are some activities, if you ever do meet in person again, that are really fun to do at the beginning of meetings, just to get to know people. Typically, we call this in person, I'd call this 4 corners, and I'd put A, B, C, and D around a room and say, if you're A, go to the A corner, B, go to the B corner, and then you can share and have a conversation to get to know each other a little better. So it's a quick little team, get to know you kind of activity. 4 corners. These are super simple. And then you get to know your colleagues a little bit. So if this is something you're interested in using, if you do get to meet in person, it is kind of a fun way to break the ice. We're going to go through, we don't have a lot of time left. Thankfully, there is a few more things that I want to just share with you to think about as you're going to start planning some more. And then you'll get, again, a little bit more planning time after I cover the next couple sections. Next up, when I was talking about the infrastructures and support mechanisms, it's this idea of school-wide schedules. And it looks like there might be some teams here who do have intervention specialists. And I know that can be something that you really have to think about in terms of scheduling. Maybe you don't, but you are utilizing other support staff at different times. So considering and thinking about school-wide schedules can be really important. Why? Because we want to try to utilize that staff that we have in the most effective way possible if we do have it, so that we can create time for students to be either pulled out or pushed in to get those different maybe tier 2 and tier 3 interventions and support. So can school-wide scheduling support intervention time for students across our campus? That's something I just want to encourage you to think about. And is there a way to utilize that staff to provide interventions? If not, is there a way that you can, again, work together within your grade level teams to provide different levels of intervention or support? How can you get creative? And then finally, so then get together as a grade level team. One thing that I'm going to ask you to consider, and that there are some resources for in there, is to look at master schedules. A lot of you might be familiar with those master schedules where you break down, this is our reading block, and each grade level might be different. Maybe you're school-wide, you have the same master schedule, but looking at and considering your master schedules is something that can be important when you start to break down when you could provide additional interventions if you do have somebody else who's able to provide that support on your campus. And that includes those staffing considerations. If you don't take a look at that master schedule and really align it, it can make our intervention specialists or maybe different SAs, IAs, instructional support teachers can make their job running around a little crazy. So, and then finally, another school-wide schedule consideration is grade level planning or teaming. So when we're talking about MTSS, part of what we're going to be doing is really diving into what our students are doing at each grade level, and having that grade level planning time and that teaming time is critically important. So if you don't already have that either during the week or on a staff development day, I'd really encourage you to build in looking at data into that grade level planning and teaming time. And then finally, using all of that to consider that intervention support time. So school-wide schedules, there are there's some examples in this folder on how to create a master schedule. There are some blank templates in there if you're interested. And they're broken down by an Excel template, and it actually even has the directions in it. If that's something that your site doesn't have already and isn't interested in doing, or you're just interested in looking at a little bit deeper because you do have some intervention supports now. And that's something that I will encourage you to look at when we get into our next breakout time. The next part of the MTSS infrastructure and support mechanisms that I want to take some time to talk about is this idea of the tiered instruction matrix. And this is really the nitty-gritty of where the interventions happen, right? We know that at tier 1, it's that core instructional program. And we want to really make sure that we have clearly defined system-wide core instructional program in each of those content areas. It can get difficult to really talk about overall impact of our interventions across the school site if grade levels are using different curriculums. Maybe they are, so just really think about that core instructional program. What core practices as a school site, what are those research-based high leverage practices that you use as a school site to ensure that all students are receiving strong core instruction. If you are going to dive into UDL, what are those UDL practices that you're talking about? So as you work together as a MTSS team, define what are universal supports. What does that tier 1 instruction look like at your school site for English language arts, for reading, for writing, for math, for science? What really define what those expectations are, and even what the differentiation might look like in those areas. Are you using specific UDL strategies? Are you using a specific focus, like collaborative conversations across all of them? So I really encourage you as a site to dive into what your tier 1 instruction is and make sure you have that solid understanding school-wide. Next up that you're going to get some time to talk about is those tier 2 supports. So if we're talking small group instruction, how are we breaking down what areas are targeted for small group instruction? Who is doing that tier 2 support at our school site? When are they doing it? And what does it look like for students to either become a part of that tier 2 instruction, or once they're in that tier 2 instruction to either move into that more intensive or move back out and just require that tier 1 instruction? And then finally that tier 3, again, who is going to be facilitating that tier 3 instruction? What are they going to be utilizing? And then how are we going to know students are either making progress and are going to be able to move back into tier 2 or maybe tier 1, or require additional steps in terms of intervention? There is another resource in your folder that is a great resource to break down what your tiered intervention matrix can look like. And it's from the Swift Center. And there's also not only an example of it, just blank that you can talk through as a grade level team. I tried to break it down in your participation guide into a simpler sort of just those core components to talk through for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. But this one is a bit more complex. In that folder, it's called MTSS Tiered Intervention Matrix Form. That form is available for you to make a copy of. It looks very daunting blank. So what I would guide your attention to is a Swift MTSS starter kit, which actually breaks down what that form would look like filled out, starting on a page a little bit further down. So let's stop sharing, and I want to share these two resources with you. This is a version of the MTSS tiered matrix form, and it's broken down. It can get very, very simple for you. For instance, this form is completed for grade 1 literacy. What you can see is when it talks about the universal supports, these are the universal supports that as a first grade team, they ensure happens as part of that tier 1 instruction. There's extra emphasis on vocabulary. They all receive the ELA block based on the Wonders reading series. They have whole group and level grouped instruction, and they use and attend to UDL principles. First grade has their literacy block from 1:30 to 3 in the afternoon. It then jumps down into this universal screening. So this, again, is just a great tool to talk through and break down how you're going to move students in and out and through your tiered systems of support. When they talk about universal screening for literacy in first grade, the tool that they're going to use is DIBELS and the MAPS assessments. Who administers those are the classroom teacher, and they at this site are able to provide coverage so that teachers can pull students one-on-one to test them. If you're familiar with DIBELS, it's a one-on-one assessment. And then when is it administered? Winter, fall, winter, spring, you can see that there. And then these are their decision rules. So how are they making decisions about who needs what tier 2 support and tier 3 support? So this is additional support tier 2. If students are not able to meet benchmark, they're scoring below the 40th percentile in MAP or in a DIBELS composite subtest, they have yellow, then it's considered to match the instructions listed below. So these are the additional supports that they might be receiving. So these are their decision rules. So if a student's exceeding, these are how they know a student's exceeding those expectations based on DIBELS and MAP. Again, if a student requires intensified support, these are what those indicators would be. They're below the 20th percentile in their MAP test. They would need that intensified support. And then when they're exceeding that, if they're above the 90th percentile or they're growing on that MAP score, then you would move them out of those intensified support options. So you're going to break down your universal screening. And this is where that instruction and support looks like, right? So what is actually happening in those intervention times? The area identified for support, again, we're just talking about literacy in first grade. These are those that are are providing this support. And this is when it's provided from 8:30 to 9:15. So this site is lucky. They have a lot of people able to provide intervention and support during this time. And during this 45-minute block, that additional support is broken down by different areas: phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. And you can see what it is they are specifically utilizing to focus on each of those areas. They're going to use Read Naturally for fluency. If they're exceeding, those students might be participating in literature circles instead. So it's broken down by what those supports for tier 2 would look like for those that are not meeting benchmark. To meet benchmark, what supports they need for each area. And then if they're exceeding, right, because with MTSS, we want to talk about students who are exceeding as well, what types of supports they can get. And then intensified. Again, for those students that are struggling and require that tier 3 support, it's increased dosage. So it's broken down what that intervention can look like. Change the group size. Maybe instead of a group of 5, they need a group of 2. Provide immediate responsive feedback. So this is just a way that you can work through either with your grade level teams. Maybe you want to do this as a site first by content area because you know you'll be making some similar decisions school-wide. This is just an example. It then dives into progress monitoring. How are you going to monitor students and determine if they still require that tier 2 or tier 3 support versus are able to move back out of that support? Remember, once a child is receiving a tiered additional support or an intensified support, it doesn't mean they have to stay there. The beauty of an MTSS system is that they're moving in and out as they need it based on that specific area. They've identified their tools that they use for progress monitoring, who's going to be administering it, and when it's administered. And then again, they have these decision rules. If instruction progress monitoring tools indicates 3 consecutive data points of increasing above proficiency, then they exit the instruction. So these decision rules are very clear so that no matter what student name they're putting in front of there, they're making those decisions based on data, right? So they're making those decisions in a way that's systematic. And so you can see here again for intensified support, how they might make those decisions. So this is just one. There's a couple other examples in here if you're interested again as well. So this one breaks down by math. So this is the MTSS starter kit here, which is in your folder. Or the MTSS intervention matrix is one that you're able to download, make a copy, and start to fill out yourself, either as a grade level or take maybe components. And then finally, I also broke it down here in just a simpler way. What do our tier 1 supports look like? Tier 2, who administers it when, and what are the areas of support? So describe the support. So you could even go just much simpler in that regard as well. Let me go back. This tiered instructional matrix, this planning for your interventions at tier 2 and tier 3, I feel like is where many schools, those that I've talked to, and even as a recent administrator, it's an area that we all probably need to engage in a lot of conversation around, just to make sure that we have some school-wide clarity about what those supports look like and how we determine if students actually do require that support, right? So that we are making decisions based on solid data and not just based on how we're feeling that day or how a student might be responding that day, right? We want to make sure we have those clear decision rules that our team, our MTSS team that you're working with is deciding on, so that we can ensure those equitable responses for our students to receive services and to move in and out and throughout those tiers. It's really easy for a student to come in, really struggle one day, and just to say, oh my gosh, they need small group instruction, and to push them into, whatever that might be. Utilizing these systems and these structures are going to take away some of that stress on how we need to make those decisions for teachers, hopefully, once they're clear. And it just becomes a process. This student is doing this. Okay, they need to move into tier 2 supports. Oh, the student met this, they need to move back out, right? And it becomes clear. Does it mean that they're not going to need maybe additional scaffolding or differentiation in their whole group instruction once they move out of the tier 2 support? No, they might still benefit from that. All students benefit from that to a certain extent. But what it does mean is at the moment, regarding phonics, they've started to bridge some of that gap. They're doing pretty well, and we want to see how they can do back in that core curriculum. Our hope and our goal with MTSS is to really provide that inclusive academic instruction and environment for all of our students, right? So that they're all participating in the general ed curriculum and able to be successful at tier 1 as much as possible. So the tiered supports are there to help students, but they're not there to make students be stuck, right? Once a student goes into tier 2, they're not a tier 2 kid now. They can move in and out of that. The next section that I love to talk about, and that I've invited my colleague Ryan to talk about a little bit, we'll be sharing some of his knowledge as well in our PLC, is data and how we start to break down data, use data. The first data point obviously is that screening data. So I'm going to encourage you, if you don't already as a system or as a school site, have clear definitions of what you use for your universal screeners. Find those, right? Clearly define what those universal screeners are. And again, really talk about what those decision rule cutoff points are, what the goal is for the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, the end of the year, and know what it means for a student to be proficient, or for a student to be somebody who needs to be looked at for tier 2 intervention, or for what it means for a student to be looked at for tier 3 intervention. Create those decision rules and make them clear as a team with your screening data. Once you have those, and you start to look at what that progress monitoring data is, make that a part of that routine in your MTSS team meeting. Progress monitoring data is going to be more frequent than that screening data. Screening is going to happen hopefully around 3 times a year for your students, where progress monitoring is going to be happening a lot more frequently. The recommendation is monthly for students in tier 2 and more like weekly for those students in tier 3 intensive support. So really break down, what is that progress monitoring tool that you're going to be using? Is it going to be formative assessments, or what formal assessments? Are you going to reuse DIBBLES if DIBBLES is a program? How are you going to make those decisions and break down utilizing that data? Again, it's those cutoff points for those tiered supports that you're going to talk through. And then another piece when we talk about data is building in, what are your procedures for reviewing data during your MTSS meetings? Is it always an agenda item? Is it an agenda item that you talk about a different content area once a month? What is your procedure for reviewing data at your MTSS meeting? And then how are you including reviewing data on a more regular basis during those grade level collaboration meetings? How are you starting to build that language into regular meetings with teachers so that when they're looking at data and making decisions about students moving in and out of those tiered levels of supports, that it just becomes a natural conversation as they're planning on a regular basis, right? Because you'll probably find that they'll be providing some of that tier 2 support for students in their own classroom. So they need to be figuring out and working together to collaborate on what the data is telling them and how they can use that information to then plan for those intervention themselves. So really think through as a team, what are those procedures for reviewing data during MTSS meetings, and then also grade level meetings. Something I'd encourage you to do is make those just a part of those regular agenda items. And I want to just kind of cover this quote. This article is in your folder as well, but that in order for this to become really effective, we know that data is reviewed by teams at least monthly for all students using those standardized problem-solving processes in conjunction with those cut points or benchmarks to determine the responsiveness to tier 1 supports and to identify students in need of targeted or individual support. And data should similarly be reviewed and on a more frequent cycle to determine the responsiveness of interventions at tier 2 and tier 3. And this is based on some research on MTSS and integrating and building up your system. All right, I've talked for a little while again, and I want to, as we wrap up this section, give you time to go back into a breakout room for a few minutes and just talk through all of those steps. These are those topics that we covered: team composition, operating procedures, how school-wide schedules can support your MTSS system. Really just briefly dove into that tiered instructional matrix that you might want to have some more discussion around. And then of course, how do you utilize data? So your next steps in this breakout room for the next few minutes is to review the topics that we just covered. What areas do you need to discuss, and what's maybe the most pressing or most important area that you want to discuss as a team? Talk about what resources you have, find your own resources, begin taking those steps. And then we're going to talk about creating those next steps in the action plan in our implementation section, which is following this right now. So based on time right now, I'm going to give you guys just about 10 minutes to go into your breakout room so that I can at least talk a little bit about implementation and share a few resources with that, because our time is flying by today. So for the next 10 minutes, I'll have you jump into your breakout rooms and just discuss maybe what are some areas you really want to focus on going forward that we covered. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a quick little discussion about some of those features and your next steps that you can take as a school site or system, and breaking down the infrastructures and support mechanisms to build up your MTSS system. This last section we're going to quickly just go into is really focused on implementation and how you can start to think about implementing some of these change efforts on your school site. I do want to clarify, since we're almost out of time, I will touch on this a little bit at PLC 1, and just share a little bit more about some implementation plan ideas for you. But I want to make sure to cover and give you just a little bit of time to talk about an action step or two for your team going forward and share some of these resources around how you can implement. So we're now in the how part. So we've got all of this knowledge about the 4 components of MTSS. We've talked about how we can start to break down and plan for some of these support systems and mechanisms in our school. And now, how do we start to actually put those into place so that it doesn't feel like, again, just another initiative at our school site, and so that it becomes something that we have that staff buy-in, that our teachers feel confident with and clear about, so that we know how and why we're making these moves in terms of implementing MTSS. One of the ways that we can do that is by having focused professional development when we talk about implementation. So what is it that you're going to be learning as a site or a district, and what is that end goal? Really having a goal that by the end of either the 6 or 8 weeks, we're going to be doing this particular strategy. Maybe we're going to be all focused on just analyzing screening data and having a deeper understanding of screening data and making that a part of our regular collaboration meetings and conversations. So having focused professional development on a specific area or part of your MTSS system can help ensure that the implementation is clear and effective for those at your school site. Another way that research tells us is effective in introducing and implementing new either instruction or new learning at a school site is through learning communities. And so with learning communities, whether it's grade levels or department, it's really setting up how you can collaborate with similar staff to break down these components of MTSS. In a grade level, again, those screening criteria is planning for small group instruction together, maybe breaking up, and one teacher is planning for phonics instruction and the other is planning for decoding. How are you going to be breaking up and supporting each other and planning together and working together and utilizing that learning community to get feedback, to help each other make decisions, and to grow the work together. And then finally, another component that we want to talk about is feedback and coaching. A big part of learning and growing when implementing something new is how we're getting feedback and coaching from one another as colleagues, and also from either if you do have a coach on your campus or within your district or your administrator, it's that specific timely feedback on exactly what it is you've been learning about and practicing implementing that can help us grow in that new implementation strategy or learning. So what specific areas for improvement are we going to focus on that we want to receive feedback on? And is there a new instructional strategy perhaps that everybody's going to be doing for tier 1 instruction that we want to focus on as a school for the next bit of time? Is it that we're really going to focus on looking at data in our collaboration meetings? What is that we're going to be doing that we can get feedback on clearly from either one another and or from our site administrator? And so one thing I do want to bring up is, because all of our systems have ways that we do professional development, that we do implement new practices or new structures like MTSS. So something for you to think about is, what do you currently do to implement a new practice at your school? Maybe you use improvement science theory, you do PDSAs to introduce new things. Maybe you use a professional learning cycle. It's not about me coming in and telling you you have to do it one way or the other, but it is about making sure that when you're implementing it, you're going to implement it clearly with that clear end goal, and to ensure that you have just that clear expectation for your teachers, and that you can really focus on implementing each component with fidelity so that it does have the biggest impact and change in your school system. And then finally, how do you monitor that impact or change? So what are you currently doing in implementation, and how do you ensure or monitor that it is making a change in your school? So these are just kind of questions that you can think about. I want to share a few different examples and some articles that I did put in this folder. The first one is just an article by Linda Darling Hammond. These are some components that in their research at the Learning Policy Institute that they call out are effective in terms of professional development. So when we think about professional development for MTSS, that can include how are we maybe teaching our school site, just what are the components of MTSS? How are we beginning to introduce each of those components and build them up so that it doesn't feel overwhelming and it feels like something attainable that our school system can do. The next thing I want to share is just a quick example of a focused professional development and what they can include. Again, it can include a vision statement and a goal, a targeted instructional practice or a focus. So one example might be teacher clarity, could be UDL practices, collaborative conversations. An example of tier 2 supports could be how are we using universal screeners. Whatever that is, it has a timeline with that planned feedback and reflection opportunities, and it also utilizes professional communities to build our staff up together so that they can collaborate and work together. This is an example of just briefly of a professional learning cycle that I know lead teams have used. It is also in your folder if you're interested in learning a little bit more about it. Another example might be the PDSA, the Plan, Do, Study, Act template from Improvement Science. Maybe you have your own site professional development plan. The real purpose of me sharing this is just to encourage you to develop that clear vision and that goal, to have a clear targeted practice that you're going to be focused on as a staff, and to really think about implementing in a clear way that's clear not only for staff, but is clear for you as a leadership team, as an MTSS team, so that we know how we can consider each, at least in like this professional cycle, each of these areas to build up our knowledge as a system and to also provide opportunities for each of our teachers to practice and engage in utilizing the different parts. This is real quick. I do apologize, but again, this is kind of broken down. This particular is, you would break it down by weeks. So perhaps you're going to do a cycle for 8 weeks. You'd put each week date there. You're going to plan meetings here. So this calls out ILT meetings. Maybe it's your MTSS meeting. You want at least 2 meetings per month. And that's really to your MTSS meeting might be 1 meeting per month. Your input trainings are those PDs. Are you going to have a PD right at the beginning just on tier 1? What is it that you're going to practice for that? What types of readings are you going to have? How are people going to get feedback? What are those collaboration meetings going to look like? And what does our learning walks look like in terms of getting feedback from one another? So this is just an example of something that you could use when you're talking about implementation. And so I want to leave you with this, and I'll maybe just give you another 3 or 4 minutes to go into your teams and to talk about what are your next steps for making change at your school. And I'd love for you to think about 1 to 2 next steps and to identify who is responsible and the date that you hope to have it by. What is something that you want to implement at your school or talk about changing at your school in terms of implementing MTSS academic interventions and supports in the next few weeks? So Adrian, I would love for them to start to wrap things up. If you have one action step your team decided on, go ahead and start to share that in the chat for us. I know it was a quick amount of time, but hopefully you at least have one thing that you're going to be taking going forward. All right. As we look ahead, our upcoming PLCs the dates are listed here. You are welcome to join any of them or the ones that just meet your needs. They're broken down by each of those 4 component areas. So the 23rd, we're going to focus on screening, the 25th on progress monitoring. The 2nd, we're going to dive a little bit more into that multi-level prevention system, breaking down and setting up those tiered systems of support. And on the 4th, bringing it all together with that database decision making. These are set up in a way where there'll be just a brief mini lesson, and then you will have team planning time. And with that, we just thank you so much for being here. If you are already registered for this, you will continue to get the information on each of those PLCs. So you are already registered for those. If you are here today, if you haven't maybe completed the registration for today, you just got the link from somebody else, please make sure to complete that registration just so that we can account for you and that you can continue to get the invites for this. But if you're registered, you should already get those invites. Please take a few moments to complete this brief survey. The PLCs are at a few different times, more in the afternoon. If they don't work for you, the recordings of those mini lessons will be available and shared out. So if you are not able to make it to one of those PLC times, look at your email and those recordings will be made available and your team can use those at their leisure, but those dates and times are a bit different. You want to take the dates and times, we'll go ahead and make sure that those dates and times are sent out in the email this afternoon with the dates and times. Again, thank you so much for taking the survey. If you have a couple questions, we'll put the OMS link in there for you. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, we are a project funded by the California Department of Education in collaboration with California Collaborative for Educational Excellence down here in San Diego at the South County SELPA. We hope that you enjoyed your time today. I thank you again so much for being here and hope that the time collaborating with your teams was beneficial and that you have some steps going forward with MTSS. Again, these videos will be made available to y'all again, and the recordings of those PLCs will be made available as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.